The blast suit was still zipped to my collarbone when my brother-in-law grabbed my wrist in the middle of his own engagement party and hissed, low enough that only the two of us could hear it. "Take that ridiculous costume off before my business partners see you. You're an embarrassment." 40 feet away, under a tent strung with string lights, 200 guests were laughing over champagne, and my own sister stood at the microphone about to introduce the man she was about to marry as the most impressive person in this family. I had exactly 6 minutes before the bomb squad's dispatch radio clipped to my belt was going to crackle to life with a call that would prove, in front of every single person at that party, exactly whose costume this actually was. Welcome to the quiet inheritance, where ordinary people face impossible families and prove that the strongest response isn't always the loudest. Every story ends with a lesson, a reckoning, or a victory worth waiting for. My name is Delphine. I'm 31, and for 6 years I've worked as a Navy explosive ordnance disposal technician. The job most people know, if they know it at all, from movies where someone in a heavy suit walks slowly toward something that could kill them in half a second. If you've ever had your entire life's work reduced, by the people who were supposed to be proudest of you, to a costume, an embarrassment, a thing to be hidden before company arrives, stay with me. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe, because you need to see what happened at that engagement party. I have to take you back 9 years, to the week I told my family I was enlisting, so you understand exactly how long this particular humiliation had been building before it finally detonated. I grew up the middle child of 3, sandwiched between my older brother Desmond, who became a corporate attorney by 26 and never let anyone forget it, and my younger sister Yolanda, who was, from the moment she could walk, the kind of effortlessly beautiful, effortlessly charming person that entire rooms rearranged themselves around without her ever having to try. My parents, Harold and Constance, ran a modestly successful chain of dry-cleaning businesses across 3 counties, the kind of steady, respectable, upwardly mobile family that measured success almost exclusively in terms other people could immediately recognize and admire: a law degree, a wedding photographed for the society pages, a house in the right zip code. I loved chemistry. I loved, specifically and unusually, the precise, methodical satisfaction of understanding exactly how things came apart, down to the molecular level. Why one compound was stable and another wasn't. Why a reaction that looked identical to the eye could behave completely differently depending on a fraction of a degree in temperature or a trace impurity in a reagent. I studied chemical engineering in college, on a partial scholarship that still left me working 2 jobs to cover the rest, while Desmond's law school and Yolanda's out-of-state tuition were both paid, without hesitation or complaint, entirely by my parents. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not resent my siblings' opportunities, not at first, not in any way that curdled into real bitterness. What I resented, slowly, gradually, over years, was the specific way my own choices were treated as smaller, stranger, less worthy of the same enthusiasm my parents brought so easily to Desmond's case wins and Yolanda's modeling gigs and pageant placements. When I told my family, at 22, freshly graduated and staring down a mountain of student debt, with a chemical engineering degree that qualified me for exactly the kind of unglamorous industrial lab work I'd spent 4 years discovering I didn't actually want, that I decided to enlist in the Navy, specifically pursuing the demanding, highly selective pipeline toward becoming an explosive ordnance disposal technician, the reaction in my parents' kitchen was not pride. It was a kind of baffled, faintly embarrassed disappointment, as though I'd announced I was joining a circus, rather than one of the most rigorously selective, technically demanding specialties in the entire United States military. "You have a chemistry degree," my mother said, standing at the stove with her back half turned to me, stirring something she didn't need to stir. "You could work at a real company. Why would you want to go crawl around defusing bombs like it's some action movie? What is that going to actually get you, Delphine?" My father, characteristically quieter, characteristically more devastating in his brevity, simply said from behind his newspaper, "Well, I suppose someone in this family has to do the strange thing." He did not look up when he said it. I remember standing in that kitchen at 22 years old, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold, the particular stillness of understanding, for the first time clearly, exactly where I ranked in my own family's estimation of what a life well-lived actually looked like. I enlisted anyway, obviously, because I have never once, across my entire adult life, made a major decision based primarily on whether my parents would approve of it, a fact that I think frustrated all three of them considerably more than they ever fully admitted. What followed was 2 brutal years of training that I will not walk through in exhaustive detail here, except to say that EOD training has one of the highest attrition rates of any specialty in the entire U.S. military. A demanding gauntlet of diving qualification, parachute qualification, and the specific. Exacting technical education required to safely render safe everything from decades-old unexploded ordnance to improvised explosive devices built by people actively trying to kill the person approaching them. I graduated in the top of my class. I want to say that plainly, without false modesty, because I think the specific, hard-won nature of that achievement matters enormously for understanding exactly how casually, exactly how thoughtlessly, it would eventually be dismissed by the people who should have understood its weight better than anyone. Over the following 6 years, I deployed twice, to assignments I am, even now, restricted from discussing in specific operational detail, and spent the years between deployments assigned to a domestic EOD unit responsible for responding to suspicious package calls, unexploded ordnance discoveries, and with increasing frequency, as certain extremist movements grew more active domestically, genuine improvised explosive device threats within our own borders. I want to describe, briefly, what the actual work involves because I think most people's understanding of it, shaped almost entirely by movies, misses the specific texture of what makes it what it is. It is not, primarily, an adrenaline sport. It is closer, in its actual daily rhythm, to a kind of extreme, high-stakes chemistry and engineering problem, solved under conditions of profound physical discomfort, wearing a blast suit that weighs upward of 80 pounds in summer heat, approaching a device you understand, with total clarity, could kill you in the time it takes to blink, using a combination of specialized robotics, X-ray imaging. And when the robots can't get close enough or the situation demands direct human hands. Walking up to it yourself, alone, while your entire team watches from a safe distance, because that is simply how the job works. Someone has to be the one who actually approaches, and for 6 years, that someone was regularly me. My family knew, in the vaguest possible sense, what my job title was. What they never once, across 6 years, seemed to actually understand, or perhaps simply never chose to engage with closely enough to understand, was what that job title actually meant in practice. I want to be fair and note that some of this gap was, admittedly, partly my own doing. Much of my work is genuinely restricted from detailed civilian discussion, and I had, over the years, developed a habit of deflecting family dinner table questions about my job with brief, vague, minimizing answers, partly out of operational necessity, and partly, I think now, out of a kind of protective exhaustion. Having learned early on that detailed answers were rarely met with the kind of engaged curiosity I'd have welcomed, and were more often met with the same faint, baffled discomfort I'd first encountered in my parents' kitchen at 22. Yolanda, meanwhile, had built, over those same 6 years, a genuinely successful career as a boutique event planner specializing in high-end weddings and corporate galas, a business she'd started with seed money from our parents that had, to her real credit, grown into a legitimately thriving enterprise with a client list that included several locally prominent families. I want to be clear that I never resented Yolanda's success itself, which was real, and which she had, in fact, worked hard to build. What I resented, increasingly over those 6 years, was the specific asymmetry in how our parents discussed our respective lives. Yolanda's newest high-profile client landing a full 10 minutes of animated dinner table conversation. My own return from a deployment I could barely discuss in detail, met with a single perfunctory, "Glad you're back safe." Before the conversation pivoted, almost immediately, Back to wedding logistics or Desmond's latest case. The specific catalyst for everything that follows arrived roughly 8 months before that engagement party, when Yolanda began dating a man named Preston Ashworth Cole, a commercial real estate developer 12 years her senior, wealthy in the specific, visible way that impressed my parents enormously: multiple properties, a membership at the exclusive downtown athletic club, the kind of expensive, understated watch that people who understand expensive watches recognize instantly, and people who don't simply register as vaguely impressive. Preston was, from the very first family dinner I attended with him present, exactly the kind of person who sized up every room he entered in terms of who mattered and who didn't, a habit I watched him apply, with increasing obviousness over the following months, specifically to me. I want to describe the first real interaction I had with Preston, because I think it established, with striking clarity, exactly the dynamic that would eventually explode at that engagement party. It was a Sunday family dinner, roughly 5 months into his relationship with Yolanda, and the conversation had turned, as it periodically did, to everyone's respective careers. Desmond talked, at some length, about a corporate litigation case he'd just won. Yolanda talked about a celebrity wedding she'd just landed as a client. When the conversation eventually, almost as an afterthought, turned to me, Preston asked, with the specific, faintly amused tone of someone asking a question he'd already decided he knew the answer to, "So what exactly do you do in the military, Delphine?" Something with, "What logistics?" Supply chain stuff. I told him plainly that I was an explosive ordnance disposal technician, that I disarmed bombs for a living, both overseas and domestically. Preston laughed, an actual short, dismissive laugh, and said, "Come on, seriously, what do you actually do?" When I told him evenly that I was being entirely serious, he studied my face for a long moment, clearly recalibrating, and then said something I have thought about many times since, a sentence that I believe, in hindsight, established the entire architecture of how he would treat me for the following months. "Huh," he said. "I would not have guessed that in a million years. No offense, but you don't really seem like the type." I did not ask him what the type was supposed to look like. I have learned, across years of exactly this kind of conversation, that the question rarely produces an answer worth hearing. Over the following months, as Preston and Yolanda's relationship progressed toward an engagement, I watched a specific pattern establish itself and deepen. One I think my parents either failed to notice, or, more troublingly, simply chose not to address because Preston represented, in their eyes, exactly the kind of successful, socially connected match they'd always hoped Yolanda would eventually make. Preston developed a habit, at family gatherings, of introducing me to his own business associates and social circle with language that ranged from vaguely dismissive to, on several occasions, outright embarrassing. "This is Delphine, Yolanda's sister. She's in the military. Does something with, equipment maintenance, I think," was an actual sentence I heard him say to one of his business partners at a dinner 4 months before the engagement party. A description so far from accurate that I initially assumed, generously, he had simply forgotten the specifics of what I'd told him months earlier rather than deliberately minimizing it. If you've ever watched someone deliberately shrink the truth of what you do, because the real version doesn't fit the image they want to project to their own social circle, you already know exactly the particular, slow-burning frustration that had been building in me for months before that engagement party. Stay with me, because what happened under that tent is not the story Preston, or my family, expected. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. I want to explain, before I get to the party itself, exactly how I ended up arriving there in a blast suit, because I think the specific mechanics of that particular collision matter enormously for understanding everything that followed. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening, held at a private event space my family had rented specifically for the occasion, an elegant outdoor venue with a large white tent, string lights, and a guest list of just over 200 people, heavily weighted toward Preston's business and social connections rather than any particular overlap with our own extended family. I had, months earlier, requested and received approval for leave specifically to attend, understanding, going in, that this was going to be an event where I would spend most of the evening being introduced, if I was introduced with any accuracy at all, as some vague, minimized version of what I actually did. What I had not anticipated, and what genuinely could not have been anticipated by anyone, was that my unit's on-call rotation, which I had specifically arranged to swap out of for that exact weekend, would end up needing me anyway, due to circumstances entirely outside anyone's control. Roughly 2 hours before the party was scheduled to begin, I received an urgent call from my unit's duty officer. A construction crew, doing excavation work at a site roughly 15 minutes from the venue, where my sister's engagement party was about to take place, had unearthed what appeared to be a significant piece of unexploded ordnance, likely dating back to a decommissioned military training facility that had operated on that land decades earlier. A live artillery round, partially corroded, in a condition that our unit's assessment protocols classified as potentially unstable. Sitting less than a mile from a residential neighborhood that was, given the discovery's timing on a Saturday afternoon, going to need to be partially evacuated as a precaution while my team assessed, and if necessary, safely rendered the device inert. The technician originally scheduled for that weekend's on-call rotation, a colleague named Sergeant Owen Marsh, who had agreed to cover for me specifically so I could attend the engagement party, had, as it happened, gone completely off-grid on a fishing trip in an area with no cell service, a detail our unit would not discover until considerably later that evening. With an active, potentially unstable ordnance situation requiring immediate response and my scheduled backup unreachable, my unit commander called me directly, understanding, fully, the personal conflict this created, and asked, plainly, whether I could respond. I want to be honest about the calculation I made in that moment, standing in my dress, already halfway ready for the party, holding my phone with my commander's voice on the other end. There was no real decision to make, not really. A live, potentially unstable artillery round sitting near a residential neighborhood does not wait for anyone's sister's engagement party, and I have never once, across my entire career, been the kind of person who would let a scheduling conflict, however personally significant, override an active public safety response. I told my commander I'd be there in 20 minutes. What made the timing genuinely, almost absurdly collide with the party itself was the specific location of the ordnance site, close enough to the venue that my unit's incident commander, coordinating logistics on a tight timeline, made the operational call to stage our response team's equipment and support vehicles in the closest available large parking area, which happened to be the overflow lot directly adjacent to the private event space, where my family's party was already underway. I arrived at the site, suited up alongside my team, worked the initial assessment and stabilization of the device for just under 2 hours, and successfully rendered it safe using a controlled disruption technique that neutralized the round without requiring a full evacuation and detonation protocol that would have disrupted considerably more of the surrounding neighborhood's Saturday evening. Once the device was confirmed safe, and my team began the process of properly recovering and disposing of the remaining ordnance material, I made a decision that, in hindsight, set the entire collision course of that evening in motion. I was still in my blast suit, minus the heavy helmet, sweat-soaked and adrenaline-flushed from 2 hours of careful, precise work, when I realized the party, just a few hundred yards away, was still going, and that I had, technically, roughly 45 minutes before my presence would genuinely be needed anywhere else, before the recovery paperwork and final site clearance would require my direct involvement again. I want to be honest that some part of me, a part I don't think was entirely conscious at the time, wanted my family to see, even briefly, even in passing, exactly what the job I did actually looked like in practice, rather than the vague, minimized version they'd spent years content to imagine. I walked, in the blast suit, minus the helmet, across the parking lot and toward the edge of the tent, intending only to briefly let my team know where I'd be and to catch a few minutes of my sister's engagement celebration before returning for the final site work. I did not intend to make an entrance. I did not intend, in any way, to disrupt the party. What I intended was simply to be present, however briefly, in the only form circumstances had left available to me that evening. Preston saw me first, from across the lawn, and I watched his face shift through several rapid expressions before settling into something I can only describe as controlled, furious embarrassment. He crossed the lawn quickly, closing the distance between us with the specific, purposeful stride of a man determined to contain a problem before it spread, and grabbed my wrist, hard enough that I felt it through the suit's thick outer layer, pulling me slightly off to the side of the tent's main entrance, out of the direct sightline of the closest cluster of guests. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice low, tight, controlled in the specific way people's voices go when they're trying very hard not to draw attention while saying something genuinely furious. "Take that ridiculous costume off before my business partners see you. You're an embarrassment." I want to describe exactly what I felt in that moment, because I think the specific texture of it matters. It was not, primarily, hurt, though there was certainly a real, sharp sting of it underneath everything else. It was something closer to a kind of cold, clarifying recognition, the plain, unambiguous confirmation, spoken directly to my face by the man about to formally join my family, of exactly the dismissive minimization I'd been quietly absorbing from him, and from my own parents for years, finally distilled into a single, unmistakable sentence. A costume, an embarrassment. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters for understanding everything that followed. I looked at Preston, still gripping my wrist, and I said, evenly, "This isn't a costume. I just spent 2 hours rendering an unstable artillery round safe 15 minutes from here. I came by to say hello to my sister on my way back to finish the job." Preston's grip did not loosen. If anything, it tightened slightly, and his voice dropped even lower, more urgent. "I don't care what it is. Take it off or go back to your car or do whatever you need to do, but do not walk into that tent looking like that. This is my night. This is Yolanda's night. We have real people here, Delphine investors, clients, people who matter. I am not having you turn this into some kind of circus act." If you've ever had someone reduce the single most demanding, most dangerous, most genuinely significant work of your entire adult life to a circus act, in a single sentence, specifically to protect their own social standing, you already know exactly the kind of cold, precise clarity that settles into a person in that moment. Stay with me, because the 6 minutes that followed are not the story Preston expected, and neither was the radio call that arrived right in the middle of them. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I want to walk through, carefully, exactly what happened in the minutes immediately following that conversation, because I think the specific sequence matters considerably more than any single dramatic beat within it. I did not, in that moment, launch into an explanation of exactly what I'd just done, exactly what the stakes of that afternoon's response had actually been. I have learned, across years of exactly this kind of dismissal, that explaining your worth to someone who has already decided it's negligible rarely accomplishes anything beyond your own further exhaustion. Instead, I simply said, evenly, "Understood," and stepped back, out of Preston's grip, intending to quietly retreat to the parking lot, find my team, and skip the rest of the party entirely, my earlier impulse to briefly share even a glimpse of my actual work with my family thoroughly, comprehensively extinguished. What I had not accounted for, standing at the edge of that tent, was my mother, who had apparently caught sight of the confrontation from a short distance away, and, misreading the situation entirely, assumed I was causing some kind of scene, and approached with the specific, brittle urgency she reserved for moments she perceived as social emergencies. "Delphine, what on earth?" she said, her voice carrying the same faintly embarrassed discomfort I'd first heard in her kitchen 9 years earlier, now sharpened by the specific stakes of her younger daughter's engagement party. "Why are you dressed like that? Go change, for heaven's sake, before people start asking questions. This isn't the time for one of your work things." I want to describe what happened inside me, hearing that sentence, as precisely as I can, because I think it represents the specific moment the entire dynamic finally, fully crystallized for me. One of your work things. 9 years of training, 2 combat deployments I could not fully discuss, 6 years of a job that required me to walk, alone, toward things designed specifically to kill anyone who approached them, reduced, by my own mother, in the space of a single dismissive sentence, to one of your work things, an inconvenience to be managed and hidden before the people who actually mattered arrived. I did not raise my voice. I did not, even in that moment, feel the specific, hot urge toward confrontation that I think some versions of this story might promise. What I felt instead was a kind of quiet, settling finality, the particular stillness of understanding, completely and without any remaining ambiguity, exactly where I stood, and had always stood, in my own family's hierarchy of what deserved pride and what deserved concealment. I need to get back to my team, I said, my voice level, entirely without heat. There's still recovery work to finish at the site. I just wanted to say hello before I left. It was at exactly that moment, standing at the edge of the tent with my mother's dismissive words still hanging in the air and Preston watching, arms crossed, with an expression of pointed, satisfied vindication, that the radio clipped to my belt crackled to life. I want to be honest that the timing was not, in any way, engineered. It was simply the ordinary, unglamorous mechanics of an active incident response, my team's incident commander checking in on final site status as our recovery vehicle prepared for departure. But the timing, entirely coincidental, could not have been more dramatically precise if I had planned it myself. "Raise, this is command," the voice crackled through, clear enough that everyone within a 15-foot radius could hear it plainly. "County EOC wants a full incident debrief before you clear the scene. Regional Command is asking for details on the disruption technique you used. They're saying it's a candidate for the quarterly training bulletin. Also, County Executive's office called. They want to personally thank the technician who kept a residential evacuation off the table on a Saturday night. That's you. They're asking if you're available for a quick call in the next 20 minutes. I want to describe the specific, total silence that fell over the small cluster of people immediately around me, my mother, Preston, and by that point, Yolanda, who had crossed the lawn in the interim, drawn by the same instinct towards social damage control that had brought our mother over moments earlier. I keyed the radio, responded with the brief, professional acknowledgement my training has made entirely automatic. "Copy, Command. I'm en route back to the site now. Can take the call once I'm clear of the incident perimeter," and clipped it back to my belt. Preston's expression, in that moment, underwent a transformation I have thought about many times since. The controlled, contemptuous confidence that had defined his entire demeanor toward me for the better part of a year did not vanish instantly, the way I think a more dramatized version of this story might have it happen. It shifted, slowly, visibly, through several stages, confusion first. As he processed language he clearly hadn't expected to hear directed at someone he'd spent months describing to his own social circle as doing equipment maintenance, followed by a kind of dawning, uncomfortable recalculation, and finally, underneath both, something that looked uncomfortably close to genuine embarrassment, though whether that embarrassment was directed at me or at his own prior behavior, I genuinely couldn't say with certainty in that moment. Yolanda, standing beside him, looked at me with an expression I had not seen from my younger sister in longer than I could immediately recall. Something that looked, unmistakably, like startled, dawning pride, layered uncomfortably over what I think was also a real measure of guilt. I did not, in that moment, deliver some carefully rehearsed speech about respect and dignity. I did not stand there and demand an apology. I have found, across years of exactly this kind of moment, that the truth, delivered plainly and without embellishment, tends to do considerably more work on its own than any speech I could construct around it. I simply looked at Preston, and then at my mother and said, "I have to get back. There's paperwork to finish and apparently a call to take. Congratulations on the engagement." I turned and walked back across the lawn toward the parking lot, still in the blast suit, while behind me I heard, faintly, the specific rising murmur of 200 wedding guests who had, by that point, definitely noticed that something significant had just happened, even if most of them had no idea exactly what. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because I think it matters as much as the party itself, and because I don't want to leave this story at the single, satisfying moment of a radio call landing at exactly the right time, without walking through what actually changed and what didn't in the months that followed. The county executive's office call, which I did take roughly 20 minutes later, standing beside our recovery vehicle at the ordnance site, was genuine. A brief, appreciative conversation thanking my team for handling a potentially disruptive residential situation with minimal disturbance, and a mention that regional command was, in fact, considering documenting the specific disruption technique I'd used as a case study for other units. Given the specific engineering challenge the corroded rounds condition had presented. I mention this not because I think a phone call from a county executive's office is, on its own, the point of this story, but because I think it's important to be honest that the drama of that party's timing was built entirely on ordinary, unglamorous professional facts, rather than any deliberate theater on my part. Word of what had happened at the engagement party spread, as these things do, through the specific mechanics of 200 wedding guests texting each other over the following days. And I heard, secondhand, through my mother, roughly a week later, that several of Preston's own business associates had approached him at the party itself, once the radio call and its immediate aftermath had settled, with genuine, curious questions about what exactly his fiancée's sister actually did, questions that Preston, according to my mother's slightly mortified retelling, had visibly struggled to answer with any real confidence, given how thoroughly he'd spent the preceding months minimizing it to vague, dismissive descriptions. My mother called me 4 days after the party, her voice carrying a specific, careful tone I did not immediately recognize, because I had so rarely heard it directed at me across the preceding 9 years. She did not, I want to be honest, deliver some fully transformed, tearfully apologetic speech about how wrong she'd been for years. What she did instead was ask me, with what struck me as genuine, if somewhat belated curiosity, to actually explain what my job involved, what that afternoon's incident had actually required of me, questions she had never, in 6 years, asked with anything approaching that specific attentiveness. I want to be honest about my own reaction to that conversation, because I think it reflects something important about how these moments actually resolve in real life, rather than how they might resolve in a more simplified version of this story. I did not feel instant, complete forgiveness or reconciliation, listening to my mother ask genuine questions about a job she'd spent 9 years treating as an embarrassment. I felt something more complicated, a real, if cautious, opening toward the possibility of a different dynamic going forward, layered over a still-present, entirely justified awareness of exactly how many years it had taken, and exactly what specific, almost theatrical collision of circumstances it had required for that curiosity to finally arrive. Yolanda called separately, 2 days after our mother, and her conversation was, I think, considerably more direct and considerably more difficult for her to have. She told me plainly that she'd been aware for months of the specific way Preston talked about my career to his social circle, and that she had, on more than one occasion, let it pass without correction, partly out of a desire to avoid conflict with her own fiancé during their engagement, and partly, she admitted, with what I believed was genuine, uncomfortable honesty, because some part of her had simply absorbed the same family hierarchy of achievement I'd been navigating since childhood, and had never fully examined why her own accomplishments seemed to require so much less defending than mine apparently did. I should have said something, she told me, her voice tight in a way I don't think I'd heard from Yolanda since we were both considerably younger. Every single time he described what you do like that, I should have corrected him, and I didn't because it was easier not to make it a thing. I'm sorry, Del, I really am. I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her saying it, and that I meant that. I also told her, with the same honesty, that an apology delivered after 200 people had already watched a live radio call correct the record for her fiancé was, while genuinely appreciated, considerably less significant than the years of smaller, quieter corrections that could have happened privately, gradually, long before any of this became a public spectacle at her own engagement party. Yolanda absorbed that without arguing, which I think, more than the apology itself, told me something real about where she actually was in reckoning with it. Preston, for his part, never called at all. I want to be honest that this did not particularly surprise or wound me, given everything I already understood about him by that point. What I heard, secondhand, through Yolanda over the following months, was that he had grown noticeably more careful, more measured, in how he described me to his business associates and social circle, a change Yolanda characterized with a kind of tired, knowing precision, as less about actually respecting you and more about not wanting to be caught looking foolish in front of his own clients again. An assessment I found, honestly, entirely plausible and entirely consistent with everything I'd observed about him across the preceding year. I want to talk about something that happened roughly 3 months after the engagement party, because I think it represents the actual, quieter resolution of this story more accurately than the dramatic radio call itself. My unit received an invitation, several weeks after the incident, to have a representative attend a regional public safety recognition dinner, an annual event honoring various first responders and specialized units across the county for significant incidents over the preceding year. My commander selected me, specifically citing the ordnance disruption technique from that Saturday, to receive a formal commendation on behalf of the unit. I want to be clear that this was not, in any dramatic sense, the towering, career-defining honor that a more embellished version of this story might construct it, as it was a modest, genuinely meaningful, but relatively low-key regional recognition dinner, the kind of unglamorous working professionals honor that exists considerably closer to reality than to Hollywood. I invited my family, with a real, if cautious, hope that they might attend. My mother came, along with my father, both of them sitting through a 2-hour dinner listening to detailed technical descriptions of various incidents my unit and several other regional first responder teams had handled over the preceding year, including a considerably more thorough, more accurate account of the ordnance incident from the engagement party weekend than either of them had previously heard. I watched my father, specifically, listen with an attentiveness I genuinely could not recall him ever directing toward any description of my work before, and when the formal commendation was read aloud, detailing the specific technical judgment involved in selecting a controlled disruption technique over a full evacuation protocol, I saw him, sitting beside my mother, wipe at his eyes once, quickly, in a gesture I don't think he intended me to notice. Yolanda came as well, without Preston, a choice she mentioned to me beforehand as deliberate, telling me, simply, "This is your night. I didn't want anything else in the room." Desmond, notably, did not attend, citing a scheduling conflict I never fully investigated the accuracy of, and I want to be honest that his absence registered quietly as one more data point in a longer, ongoing pattern I've made a slow, deliberate peace with over the years, rather than as any fresh, acute wound. I do not want to end this story pretending that a single dramatic radio call, however well-timed, however satisfying to witness, permanently, completely rewrote 9 years of accumulated family dynamics. That is not, in my honest experience, how these things actually resolve. What changed, in the months following that engagement party, was something more modest, and I think, ultimately more durable than a single dramatic reversal. A genuine, if gradual, shift in how my mother and Yolanda specifically engaged with the actual substance of my work. A shift built less on the theater of that single evening and more on the slower, more difficult work of actually asking questions, actually listening to answers, actually correcting old habits of minimization in the smaller, quieter, less dramatically visible moments that make up the actual texture of a family relationship. Preston and Yolanda's wedding took place 8 months later. I attended, in a dress rather than a blast suit, and gave a short toast at the reception that made no mention whatsoever of engagement parties or radio calls, focused entirely, deliberately, on my genuine hope for my sister's happiness, a choice I made consciously, understanding that some victories are best left resting quietly in the past rather than dragged, unnecessarily, into every subsequent family gathering. Here's what I learned, standing at the edge of that tent 9 months earlier, in a blast suit soaked through with sweat, listening to the people who were supposed to be proudest of me call the most demanding, most genuinely significant work of my life an embarrassment, a costume, a circus act. People can spend years deciding, privately and then eventually out loud, Exactly how much of your actual life is worth acknowledging in front of the people they consider important. But the truth of what you actually do, what you actually risk, what you actually carry, does not particularly care how carefully someone has constructed a smaller, more convenient version of you to present to their own social circle. It only needs the right moment, sometimes an entirely unplanned one, arriving through nothing more dramatic than an ordinary radio call, to speak for itself, clearly, in front of exactly the people who most needed to hear it. If you've ever had the realest, hardest, most significant part of your life reduced to something to be hidden before the people who actually matter arrived, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. If there's a part of your own life that the people closest to you have quietly, persistently minimized, find one small, calm way to let the actual truth of it be seen, on your own terms, without needing to shout to be heard. Comment, the one who wore the suit, if you made it to the end with me. Share this with someone whose real work has ever been called a costume by someone who should have known better. And subscribe to the Quiet Inheritance, because there's always another tent, another radio call, and another truth waiting for the moment it finally gets to speak for itself.